Thank you very much. Well, Alan, I thank you very much for a very gracious introduction. You sometimes wonder, because Alan and I were teammates back there in those hectic years. Among the duties that went with my job and his were some such as serving on the Board of Regents of the University of California. And that was a period in which you did not boast of only living a stone's throw from the campus. But Alan did a great job for California, and I know what he's doing for your organization. These are confusing and disturbing times for you members of an endangered species. You know, you can lose money just by hanging on to it. And then there are the environmental extremists. I spoke recently in Las Vegas to a convention out there, and when I entered the building, the casino was being picketed. They were carrying signs that said, "Don't shoot craps. They have as much right to live as you do." But speaking of Las Vegas, I have to tell you, a few years ago, I was addressing the Cattlemen's Association there. It's become quite a convention city. And on the way in, one of those fellows that was over there for the action grabbed me by the arm. He recognized me, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I told him. Well, he said, "What's a bunch of farmers doing in Las Vegas?" And I just couldn't help it. I said, "Buster, they're in a business that makes a Las Vegas crap table look like a guaranteed annual income." But of course, as I said, these are confusing times. Even the nursery rhymes have changed. There was an old lady who lived in a shoe. That's all she could afford for $80,000. At least one thing is true in inflation. You can use a dime for a screwdriver yet. But I'd like to talk to you not particularly about your problems. You're pretty familiar with those. But about yours and the problems that affect all of us in this land today. About what has happened with regard to government and its interference in the marketplace, and particularly about the need to communicate. The need not only as individuals to communicate, but the need for people like yourselves in organizations such as this to communicate with others so we can find out how together we can meet some of these problems. Now, I have a story that illustrates what good communication is. Maybe some of you have heard me tell it before, but if so, you'll just have to remember that life not only begins at 40, but so does the tendency to tell the same story over and over again. But Danny Villanueva, who used to place kick for the Los Angeles Rams and later the Dallas Cowboys, and then became a sports announcer in Los Angeles, told this story to illustrate communications. He said that, it's having something to say and then the manner in which it's told. He was having dinner one night with a young ball player that played with the Dodgers. They were talking sports. The young wife was bustling about getting the dinner ready, and the baby started to cry. And over her shoulder, she said to her husband, "Change the baby." And this young ball player was embarrassed in front of Danny. He says, "What do you mean, change the baby? I'm a ball player. That's not my line of work." She turned around, put her hands on her hips, and she communicated. She said, "Look, Buster, you lay the diaper out like a diamond. You put second base on home plate, put the baby's bottom on the pitcher's mound, hook up first and third, slide home underneath, and if it starts to rain, the game ain't called. You start all over again." But in every decision of the problems that confront us today, the question usually arises, what should government do about those problems? May I suggest that government has already done too much about them? Government is not the answer. It is the problem. Possibly this began with the traumatic experience of the Great Depression, when we turned to government for answers that government has neither the right nor the capacity to provide. And somewhere along the line we forgot that government has a built-in tendency to grow beyond the consent of the governed. We can turn to our English cousins for an example. In England in the year 1803, they created a new public job. It called for a man to stand on the cliffs of Dover with a spyglass and ring a bell if he saw Napoleon coming. They didn't get rid of that job until 1945. The government program once started is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. The deterioration of every government begins with the decay of the principle upon which it was founded. That's as true today as when it was written in 1748. In his memoirs, Arthur Kroc, Washington bureau chief for the New York Times, wrote, "The United States merits the distinction of having discarded its past and its meaning in one of the shortest spans in modern history." Our meaning, what he was discussing, I think, could be found in the Constitution. Now, I know every country has a Constitution. I've read the Soviet Constitution. I've seen the familiar terms there, such as we find in our own. Right of assembly, right of free speech. Of course, they don't allow them those things, but it's there in the Constitution. And then I found myself one day wondering, what is the difference between these other constitutions and our own? Why has ours had the history that it has had? And the difference is so inconspicuous that you almost overlook it, and yet it is so great that it tells the entire story. All those other constitutions are written by the government, and the government is telling the people what they can do. Our Constitution was written by the people, and it says, we, the people, will allow the government to do the following things. Now, Lord Acton of England, that's the same Lord Acton who wrote Power Corrupts and Absolute Power Corrupts Absolutely. 70 years after the adoption of the Constitution, he said of the men who had written it, they had solved with astonishing ease and unexampled success two problems which had heretofore baffled the capacity of the most enlightened nations. They had contrived a system of federal government which prodigiously increased national power and yet respected local liberties and authorities, and they had founded it on the principle of equality without surrendering the securities for property and freedom. And then his lordship added that the genius of our Constitution was that by the development of the principles of federalism, we had produced a community more powerful, more prosperous, more intelligent, and more free than any other the world had ever seen. Now, what he was praising specifically in that Constitution was one article, the 10th article of the Bill of Rights, which says that the federal government has only those powers delegated to it by the people, and all others remain with the states or with the people. Thomas Jefferson, at the time of the adoption, cautioned about that same particular 10th clause. He said to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power, no longer susceptible of any definition. For about 150 years, federalism served us well, and we became the miracle of the world. Unfortunately, we're no longer practicing it. For some 35 years, decisions affecting our lives and our work are no longer made by the units of government close at hand and accessible to us. Through the bribery inherent in federal grants and regulations spawned by bureaucrats who form a fourth branch of government, the 10th article of the Bill of Rights has been effectively repealed. We're governed by permanent employees who actually determine power to a greater extent than do our elected representatives. A tax policy is not designed to raise revenue for government's legitimate functions, but to redistribute the earnings of the most productive to the least productive. And it has made government the greatest cost item in the family budget. Today, government costs the average family more than food, housing, and clothing, all put together. In 1930, the governments of this country, federal, state, and local, only took a dime out of every dollar earned, and 1/3 of that was all the federal government had or needed. Today, those governments are taking 44 cents out of every dollar earned, and 2/3 of that is needed by Washington. It prorates out to $9,600 for every family in the United States. And yet, this, the fastest growing cost item in this inflationary age, is not one of the factors used in computing the cost of living index, possibly because government profits by inflation. In California, my own state, every time inflation goes up a dime, the state gets 17 cents in added revenue. A Supreme Court justice has said the time has come, indeed is long overdue, for the wisdom, ingenuity, and resources of American business, and that includes agribusiness, to be marshaled against those who would destroy it. The first essential for the businessman is to confront the problem as a prime responsibility of corporate management. We're unique in all the world. We are 50 sovereign states joined together in a federation. We're fast becoming an authoritarian, centralized power in which the states have been driven down to being simply administrative districts of the federal government. I believe the great issue of our time is to restore the balance between the levels of government. Let Washington turn back to the states and local communities the programs which it has usurped and which it is ill-equipped to administer. Some of those... Now, at the same time, let me hasten to say, Washington should not dump those programs on state or local government. Washington should also turn back the sources of revenue which it has usurped and which could properly be administered at the state level. It makes no sense. It makes no sense for them to continue to take our money to Washington, where it pauses briefly while a carrying charge is deducted, and then send it back to us only in the transition. As it comes back to us, it is their money they are giving to us, and they tell us exactly how we must spend it. It isn't as difficult as it might seem to change this. How difficult would it be to add a line to the federal income tax law that would say X% of the money collected in this tax will remain in the states where it was collected for the states to use as they see fit? I mentioned programs could be turned back. Let me give a couple of examples. Welfare, which is commonly termed in Washington the welfare mess. But who made it a mess? In the very beginning of this country, charitable, compassion, the care for the needy took place at the local level where people were familiar with the problems of their neighbors. Let me give you an example of what has happened under this program, in which now, born of compassion, it is deteriorated to where there is a permanent segment of our society that is virtually trapped economically in the welfare system and cannot escape. Why? Because there is a permanent structure of government now whose lives and whose careers depend on having these clients to justify their existence. There are today more than half the people of this country, 124 million Americans, who are dependent for total or major part of their annual income on tax dollars, paid for by the less than half of the other population. A man earning $400 a month with a wife and 2 children is considered today by the government to be a member of the working, deserving poor. And so, due to the perquisites of public assistance, his income is actually not $400, but about $810 a month. It doesn't take him long to realize that if he quits his job and doesn't work at all, he only loses $92.50. The perquisites of public assistance will take up the slack for the rest. But that isn't what is so vicious. What is truly vicious is that if this man is ambitious, and we found in our welfare reforms that most of them wanted nothing more than to escape and to be able to come out in the competitive labor market with the rest of us. If he is ambitious and wants to work his way off welfare, he can't afford to. Because for every dollar he earns above $400, he loses $1.05 in his income. At $1,000 a month, he will find that he is getting less, $14.55 less than when he was earning $400. Another program that should be turned back entirely to us at the local level. We built the greatest school system the world has ever seen at the local school district level. I can make a case for you that the decline in the quality of public education began when federal aid to education became federal interference in education. Now in Washington, on another side, we're seeing the government engaging in what has become termed in Washington jawboning. They want to hold down prices and they want to hold down wages, and this is part of a fight supposedly against inflation. Well, I know that Samson slew the Philistines with the jawbone of an ass. That does not make it an appropriate tool for running the country. Inflation has one cause, and it isn't wages and prices. They're the result. Inflation is caused by government spending more than government takes in. Let me give you one set of figures. They try to make it so mysterious, as if inflation is a plague of locusts, or something that we just can't help. It just came upon us. In 1940, there were $63 billion in currency in circulation in the United States. In 1977, there were $806 billion of currency in circulation in the United States. 1,000% increase in money for probably a half again, not that much, about a 50% increase in the goods and services that money was chasing. And that is inflation. Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, said government is the only entity that can take a useful commodity like paper, smear it with some ink, and render it absolutely worthless. There's a widespread belief in our land today in political and economic mythology created by political demagogues. There's an intolerable interference in the marketplace, urged on by spokesmen for a variety of causes, some worthy in themselves, but questionable as to whether they're a proper concern of government. A German statesman named Bismarck once said, if you like sausages and laws, you should never watch either one of them being made. Profit is a dirty word, blamed for most of our social ills. Free enterprise is becoming far less free in the interest of something called consumerism, and property rights are fast being eroded in the name of environmental protection. It is time we remind ourselves that property rights, profit, and freedom are inseparable, and you can't have the third unless you continue to be entitled to have the first two. And yet intellectuals in the groves of academia contend that the answer to the problems is the adoption of more of the features of socialism. Well, now, you can hardly call these eminent scholars ignorant. It's just they know so many things that aren't true. The miracle of capitalism is self-evident. Our government has given us a pretty good example, because they have stated that the poverty level in the United States is a standard of living that happens to be 8 times higher than the average standard of living for all the rest of the world. We eat better for a lower percentage of our earnings than any other people on earth. And you are responsible for that. With all of the inflation, you in the agricultural industry, who are blamed probably more often than anyone else because of the housewife in the marketplace shopping and seeing visibly the frequent rise in prices. And yet, as a percentage of earnings, food costs since 1960 in the United States have gone down 21%. Americans spend only 16% of their income for food on the average. In the same period, the cost of government has gone up as a percentage of your earnings by 20%. Once a group of scholars not too long ago did a comparison of food prices between the Soviet Union and the United States. They had to translate the food prices into how many minutes and hours of work had to be put in at the average wage in each country to buy these items. They found, with only one exception, that the Russian has to work from 2 to 10 times as long to buy the various food items as does his American counterpart. The one exception was potatoes. And there on the potato bins in Russia, the food prices, the food tags, came out to where they were cheaper than they are in America. There was only one hitch. They didn't have any potatoes. But you know, I'm sure, you're all familiar with the figure that the Soviet Union is such a classic example of this. Soviet Union some years ago, faced with the low morale on their collective farms, finally turned to a little bit of capitalism, and they gave every farm worker the opportunity to have a few acres of his own in which he could plant and harvest and do what he wanted to do and sell in the marketplace if he wanted to. And today, on that only 4% of the land that is farmed in that private manner, that 4% is raising something like 60% of all of the foodstuffs that Russia consumes, 68% where meat is concerned. But this nation, once so proud of its industrial genius, is being outcompeted in world markets. 1960, the gross national product of Japan was less than 1/5 of that of the United States. Now, those people, only about half the population of the United States, living on a territory that's no bigger than the one state of California, has a gross national product that is more than 2/3 as big as ours. Maybe we should heed the warning of a man who came to our country about 130 years ago. He was a Frenchman, a scholar, attracted here by the great miracle of productivity that America had become in even those few short years of its existence. And he wrote a book about the miracle he found. But even then, he saw things that made him put in that book a warning to us that we should be on guard lest we find ourselves covered by a network of regulations. And he said if that came to pass, we would one day become a nation of timid animals with government the shepherd. Well, today we are covered by tens of thousands of regulations, and we add enough new ones each year to fill 70,000 pages of the Federal Register. A study of most of corporate America has indicated, economists said, that if we could eliminate unnecessary regulation of business, we'd cut the rate of inflation in half. The steel industry complies with 5,600 regulations administered by 26 separate agencies. 164 agencies regulate hospitals alone, and it adds $35 per day per patient to the hospital costs. The textile industry puts in 538,000 man-hours a year filing reports required by government. You know, I was in Indiana recently making a speech, and there's a fellow there with a small shop. He's got a 12-foot door at the front and a 12-foot door at the back. And the OSHA inspectors came in one day. and told him that he'd have to put up exit signs. They said he might have a new employee who, in the event of fire, could become confused and not find his way out. And the fella asked a pretty logical question. He said, if he can't see a 12-foot door, how's he going to see an exit sign? I dare say everyone in this room has climbed a ladder at some time or other. How we did it without OSHA's 144 rules and regulations about ladder climbing, I'll never know. The first one of which is, in order to climb a ladder, you begin by facing it. Now, you know we'd have never thought of that by ourselves. The General Accounting Office in Washington is responsible for public employees' safety. They have recently inspected the OSHA headquarters building. They have found it in violation of 300 of OSHA's own safety regulations for the rest of us. But too many of us have switched rather than fight. Too many of us have turned to government in some problem, recognizing we should find the answer for ourselves, but we throw it off to government. I worry that the great corporations have abdicated their responsibility to preserve the free marketplace. Maybe it's a fear of rocking the boat, or maybe they now have assumed so much power it's a fear of retaliation. But we'd all better learn, when you get in bed with government, you're going to get more than a good night's sleep. There are alternatives. I don't know whether you know the story of the little lady out in New Mexico. She and her husband own a business. She's the president of the company. And this is a backyard business with 5 employees. And 2 OSHA inspectors came to her door. Madam President said, when they explained their mission, where's your warrant? And they said, we don't need one. She said, you do to come in here, and closed the door. Well, they went out and they got a warrant. When they came back, she had her lawyer with her. He read the warrant and he said it does not show probable cause, and they closed the door again. Well, her case went to court. In the meantime, up in Idaho, there was an old fella had a subcontracting business in plumbing and electrical work, 35 employees. He'd wondered what he would do. And he'd heard about the lady in New Mexico. Well, they came to his door, and he said, a warrant. Well, they read in paragraph 8A of the OSHA Act to prove they didn't need one, and he pointed to a framed copy of the Constitution on the wall and said, I think there's a higher law. Well, they went away, but they too had heard about the lady in New Mexico. They didn't get a warrant. They got a court order. And when they brought it back, he defied it and was cited for contempt of court. His family tried to talk him out of it. Even his lawyer tried to talk him out of it. Said, you can't fight the United States government. And I love the old boy's answer. He said, we ask our young men to fight and die for freedom. Maybe it's time us old duffers did something. Maybe you know the outcome already. A few months ago, the United States Supreme Court, in the case of Barlow versus the United States, ruled that henceforth, yes, OSHA inspectors will have to approach your door bearing a warrant showing probable cause, or you can run them off the place. But why don't more of us challenge the arrogance of officialdom? We're organized in all kinds of ways, as you're organized here. Corporate America's allies are the independent businessmen and women. There are trade associations, professional groups. And yes, with regard to the excesses of environmental extremists, organized labor. Why don't we set up communications between our groups and rally to come to the aid of individuals or industries and professions when they're threatened by the barons of bureaucracy? Certainly we should not leave the doctors to fight against socialized medicine on their own, because if they're socialized, the patients will be socialized. We can discover what other groups are already doing, answers that they may have found. But most of all, we'd turn the spotlight of truth on that political and economic mythology. A recent poll of college and university students found that they estimated profits in America averaged 45%. That's just 9 times as high as profits really average. It isn't surprising the kids made that mistake. In the same poll, the professors guessed the profits were even higher. The corporate America, for example, is not in the hands of a few of the idle rich. 1/3 of the equity capital of American business and industry today is owned by employee pension funds. 380 million life insurance policies are based on the investment of your premiums in that same corporate and business America. Turn the spotlight of truth on the tax demagoguery. The demagoguery that only the low-income pay taxes, the others have found ways, those who are more affluent, to avoid their just payment of taxes. Well, a figure answers that, a very simple figure. When you earn something in excess of $20,000 a year, just a little over that, you become a member of a very exclusive club. You are paying 10%, or you belong to 10% of all of the earners in America. You are paying 50% of all the tax, and you only take 5% of all of the deductions that are allowed under the so-called loopholes in the tax laws. And then there's the demagoguery that business can be made to pay taxes, and if they pay a greater share than you and I as individuals, we'll be relieved of some of our burden. Politicians preaching this aren't deliberately dishonest. They're economically illiterate. Business doesn't pay taxes. Business collects taxes for government. And all of you are engaged in that. From the raising of the food and fiber, from the drilling and the mining for minerals, on up through the transportation, the processing, the production, and on out through the is made up of 131 accumulated taxes. There are 100 in an egg, and I know that chicken didn't put them there. Some place between her and the market, they crept in. But politicians love these hidden taxes. The people don't understand this. It's just never been explained to them. Politicians love them because they hide the true cost of government from the people. They are a hidden sales tax. It's time the people knew that the government uses the taxing policy, as I said before. As one Undersecretary of the Navy explained it to a congressional committee, he said taxes have a higher purpose. They can be used to penalize particular industries and economic groups. And here we have the cause of much of the disruption of the marketplace. Washington talks tax reform. The only real reform is reduce the cost of government, which has become a drag on the economy and is pulling us all down. You know, the total public and private debt is increasing 4 times as fast today as the output of goods and services. We're all aware that the federal debt is now in excess of $800 billion. The annual interest payment is $50 billion. But what of the other unfunded obligations, the off-budget programs, the liability of retirement payments, and so forth? Our government has been using some exotic bookkeeping methods which would jail you if you tried them. The total debt in unfunded liabilities of the federal government is between $6 and $7 trillion. Social Security is unfunded on a 75-year actuarial basis by $17 trillion. We're just getting used to learning about billions, and now we're going to have to start talking in trillions. Does anyone here know how much a single billion is? Just 1 billion. 1 billion minutes ago, Christ was walking on this earth. 1 billion hours ago, our ancestors lived in caves, and it's questionable that they discovered the use of fire. If you gentlemen would send your wives out on a shopping spree and give them each $1 billion, but tell them not to spend more than $1,000 a day, they won't be home for 3,000 years. But in Washington, D.C., it's $1 billion every 19 hours. And when the new budget's adopted, it's going to go up to almost $1.5 billion every day. And yet the government goes right on developing miracle cures for which there are no known diseases. The government responds when the people speak in a forceful manner. Proposition 13 in California proved that. Has the time not come in this computerized age for us to be able to sit down and work out what is the optimum percentage of the overall earnings in the private sector that government can take for itself before it begins to drag and reduce the efficiency of the private sector? And having determined what that percentage is, then set a limit by law that that is the percentage that government can take from the private sector. That it will prosper when we prosper, it will suffer when we suffer. But that will be its limit. We all have a stake in the energy problem. This shouldn't be left to the oil and gas producers as their battle to win or lose. The newly passed energy bill is an unworkable interference by government in the marketplace. They have, under the euphemism that they're going to decontrol natural gas, they have actually invaded states' rights with now taking over control of gas that is used within a state, doesn't cross state lines. They have now created as many as 23 different classifications of gas for pricing purposes. A well drilled to 15,001 feet will have a different price than a well that's drilled to 14,999. This may be its only saving grace, that is so complex it'll be impossible to implement and administer. The government continues to interfere, and it makes no more sense than it did in 1920 when it told us that we only had enough oil left for 15 years. 19 years later, they told us we only had enough left for 13 years. We've done a lot of driving since then, and we'll do a lot more. If they will only recognize that our problem is not a shortage of fuel, it's a surplus of government. The energy industry has the same problem that you have, and they should be fought together. Let government get out of the way and turn you loose in the free marketplace to let the incentives of that marketplace judge how your success will be. You know, it has been said that politics is the second oldest profession. I have come to realize in recent years it bears a great similarity to the first. You know, Massachusetts, for any of you who might be from there, they have a new bank commissioner now. And she has recently stated, because there is a hostility in government, just a kind of hostility toward the private sector, toward business and industry. This bank commissioner in Massachusetts says that banks focus almost entirely on financial soundness. She wants to change that. I don't think the depositors would agree with her. Government has legitimate functions which it performs very well. Our problem is when it goes beyond and engages in competition with the private sector, that it does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector can do. Well, so far maybe I've touched too much on the bad news. The good news is that, like with Prop 13, there is an awakening taking place across this land. Scores of corporate entities have decided to quit feeding the alligator, hoping he'll eat them last. They're underwriting programs to eliminate that mythology, establishing communications with employees and with customers. They formed political action committees that were the talk of this last general election. In the depths of this Great Depression, the president of this country said, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." We've survived that depression. We've survived 4 wars in my lifetime. I think we've had enough of sideline kibitzers telling us this system, which they themselves have thrown out a sink by their social tinkering, can only be saved by more tinkering and even replaced by government management and control. This system has never failed us once. We fail it. We fail it when we turn over to government problems that are ours to solve, when we lose faith in the marketplace. We fail it when we forget the greatness that we ourselves as the American people have. I used to have a fantasy when I was governor. I used to wonder, having met all over this land people like yourselves and knowing the capacity of Americans, I used to wonder what had happened if we all closed the doors and slipped away, how many weeks it would take for any of you to miss us. It's been said that history is the patter of silken slippers descending the stairs and the thunder of hobnailed boots coming up. Back through the years, we've seen people fleeing the thunder of those boots seek refuge in this land. And now many of them see the signs that they ignored in their own homeland before they fled. They see the signs appearing here. How many of you have had the experience I've had of someone, a new American, coming here once as a refugee, coming to me and warning, saying, I'm seeing these things. I ignored them and then had to flee. And then usually he'll say, are we going to have to flee again? And he usually answers his own question. He said, but where? If freedom is lost here, where in the world will you ever find it again? Will we, before it's too late, use the vitality of the marketplace to save this way of life? Or will we take a chance that one day we may face our children or our children's children when they ask us where we were and what we were doing on the day that freedom was lost in America? Thank you very much.